Hello, everyone. Tonight we are going to step into the polished shoes of a young woman who, in the 1950s, became queen of a faltering empire with nothing more than a stiff upper lip and some truly impractical hats. Imagine this. A prim little girl in bobby socks, standing in the middle of Buckingham Palace, watching men in powdered wigs bow to her father. She's clutching a stuffed animal. It's the 1930s. The palace smells like leather polish and cold stone, and somewhere, behind those tall drapes, the future is stretching and yawning. You might not survive. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I'm doing here. And let me know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's get this story started tonight. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born in 1926, but the throne wasn't remotely on her baby radar. She was third in line behind her uncle Edward and her father Albert. People called her Lilibet because her own name was too tricky for her toddler tongue. Even as a child, she had a stare that could flatten a dessert cart, but the world didn't think she'd need to use it as queen. But then, cue the family drama, Uncle Edward ran off with a divorcee named Wallis and torched the entire British succession. This, by the way, is the royal equivalent of quitting your job to become a barista in Bali. So just like that, little Lilibet's dad became King George VI, and she became the heir apparent. And she hated attention. She didn't grow up playing queen with dolls or swirling around in tiaras. She was more of a pony girl, as in actual ponies. Her Shetland pony was named Peggy, and she could name every dog in the royal kennel by age 3. But none of that prepped her for World War II. When London went black during the Blitz, Elizabeth and Margaret were whisked to Windsor Castle. There, surrounded by ancient tapestries and blackout curtains, Elizabeth developed what one biographer called a majestic boredom. She studied, knitted, waved in slow motion. And then, suddenly, at 18, she demanded to join the war effort. That's right. She became a mechanic. You might have seen the photo. Her hair perfectly set, sleeves rolled up, elbow deep in the greasy guts of a truck. Technically, she was part of the Auxiliary Territorial Service, where she learned to change tires, diagnose engine issues, and probably swear under her breath when the wrench slipped. Historians still debate whether this was just a PR stunt, but weirdly enough, she really did finish the training. The future queen could drive a stick shift before she could vote in a general election. One official report described her as eager but not particularly gifted with engines. Relatable. And then love entered the chat. She first saw Philip of Greece and Denmark when she was 13 and he was 18, tall, sunburned, and just arrogant enough to be interesting. Over the years, they wrote letters. During the war, he served in the Royal Navy. She listened to the news and underlined his name in the newspaper. By 1947, they were engaged. The royal family wasn't thrilled. He had no money, weird relatives, and smoked like a chimney. But Elizabeth was done asking for permission. Their wedding was broadcast on the radio. Millions tuned in to listen to the creaking of floorboards in Westminster Abbey and the rustling of silk. It was supposed to be a fairy tale. But fairy tales don't usually involve rationed fabric and a public that had just survived food stamps and air raids. She was only 21, and she already had the weight of a kingdom hovering above her head like a very ornate anvil. By the end of the 1940s, with 2 small children, Charles and Anne, and a husband constantly being told to pipe down and smile more, Elizabeth was already quietly rehearsing for a role she didn't want to rush. But history doesn't wait for your calendar to clear. Because in just a few years, that quiet rehearsal would turn into a show that never ends. And it would begin in the most unexpected place imaginable, among the monkeys and shadows of Kenya. They had just seen an elephant. It was February 1952, and Elizabeth and Philip were in Kenya, on the first stop of a Commonwealth tour, standing in for her ailing father. They had spent the night at a place called Treetops Hotel. Yes, it was literally a hotel built into the trees. Think Swiss Family Robinson meets colonial awkwardness. You could hear baboons in the branches. The air was heavy with the smell of rain and damp wood, and somewhere nearby, a lion made a sound like a backfiring lorry. She went to bed a princess. By dawn, she was a queen. but no one told her right away. News of King George VI's death arrived via telegram, slow and clunky like everything imperial. Somewhere between a cable and a whisper, the message travelled up a dirt path, past stunned servants and wild animals. For several hours Elizabeth wandered the lodge grounds smiling at birds, utterly unaware that the monarch was now herself. And when she was finally told, on a crumpled piece of paper handed to Philip first, she didn't cry, she didn't faint. According to an aide, she looked down, went still and said, "I suppose this means we must go back." That's not poetry. That's exhaustion wrapped in royal training. One official historical fact: the moment of King George VI's death was recorded not in a palace or hospital, but quietly at Sandringham. He died in his sleep, a cigarette by his bedside. The man who once steadied a nation during the war left behind a daughter he had never expected to carry that same burden so soon. And it gets weirder. Elizabeth didn't have mourning clothes with her. The royal protocol required black, always black. So when the plane landed back in London, they stalled on the tarmac while someone scrambled to find an appropriate outfit. Yes, Britain's future queen literally had to sit in an airplane until someone fetched her a black dress. Historians still debate whether the delay was for optics or respect, but the symbolism stuck. You don't step out as a monarch until you're wearing grief like armour. Winston Churchill, back in office again, reportedly aged 5 years in a night. He had hoped Elizabeth would have more time. She was only 25, newly married, and her father had not groomed her to rule now. But now had arrived, and it didn't care about her schedule. The announcement hit the airwaves. The king is dead. Long live the queen. A sentence designed to slice your breath in two. The crowds that gathered outside Buckingham Palace were eerily quiet. No wild sobbing, no chaos, just umbrellas, cigarette smoke, and a low murmur of disbelief. People didn't know what to feel. They barely knew this new monarch. She was a voice on the radio, a face in the newspaper. She still looked like someone's niece in pearls. Inside the palace, the mood was confusion, wrapped in velvet. Philip, ever the outsider, was suddenly married to the most famous woman in the world, and his surname, Mountbatten, would not be passed on to their children. The House of Windsor, unchanged. The man was not thrilled. He reportedly stormed around muttering, "I am nothing but a bloody amoeba." Fair. And yet Elizabeth didn't flinch. In a grainy film reel from those first days, you can see her walk into a council meeting with a calm that seems robotic. Her voice was low, almost sleepy. Her eyes blank, unreadable. People projected everything onto her, their sorrow, their hope, their leftover dreams from the war. She wasn't allowed to have emotions of her own. She signed her name, Elizabeth R. The R stands for Regina, Latin for Queen. It's the kind of detail that would be scrawled on tea towels and war memorials for decades. But in that moment, it was just a shaky signature on a moment in history she hadn't asked for. By the end of that first week, the entire empire had turned to face her. India, Pakistan, Canada, Australia, all watching, waiting, wondering if this shy, awkward girl with mechanic's hands and perfectly matched gloves could carry the weight. She didn't answer them. She just kept walking forward. The day of the coronation dawned cold, wet, and blindingly gold. It was June 2nd, 1953, and while most of London was still rubbing sleep from its eyes, Westminster Abbey was already teeming with embroidered clergy, stiff foreign dignitaries, and enough velvet to upholster every sofa in Wales. Outside, people had camped on the streets overnight, yes, in the rain, just to catch a glimpse of a horse or a wink from a royal guard. And here's the weird part. Many of them brought stepladders. Not umbrellas, not sandwiches. Stepladders! They wanted height, not comfort. Meanwhile, inside Buckingham Palace, Elizabeth sat absolutely still while her hair was pinned into place. The crown was so heavy it had to be practiced with a sack of potatoes, literally. She had balanced a potato-stuffed model on her head for weeks. Historians still debate whether this was actually helpful, or just one of those royal traditions no one dares question anymore. This was not just a party. It was the first coronation to be televised. Against Churchill's advice, mind you. He thought it would cheapen the mystique. But Elizabeth insisted. She wanted her people to see her crowned, not just hear about it. Over 20 million Britons tuned in, huddled around televisions borrowed from neighbours, peering through static and screen flickers to watch a woman walk through an ancient ritual with frightening poise. Now, remember that official historical fact. The coronation of Elizabeth II was the most watched event in British television history at the time. The BBC had to invent new techniques to cover it, including sneaking cameras into the Abbey behind floral arrangements. Nothing says innovation like hiding behind chrysanthemums. The coronation itself was long, like medieval long. Almost 3 hours. There were robes so long they required child assistance. There were hymns that seemed to last entire lifetimes. One choirboy famously fainted during the anointing, possibly from heat, possibly from boredom. And in the middle of it all, Elizabeth knelt. A priest dabbed her head, chest and hands with oil made from oranges, roses, cinnamon and, wait for it, civet, which is an oil derived from the scent glands of a small African mammal. Yes, even her holy moment smelled a bit like a forest on edge. The anointing was done behind a golden canopy held up by 4 knights. It was considered too sacred for cameras. Just imagine that, the whole world watching, and then suddenly 4 guys hoisting up a curtain while the most important part happens in secret. It was like a divine halftime show with no footage. Then came the crown. The imperial state crown weighs nearly 5 pounds and contains a sapphire that was once embedded in the eye socket of Edward the Confessor. That's not symbolism, that's just creepy. Still, when they placed it on her head, Elizabeth didn't flinch. She simply rose, small, pale and barely 27, and turned to face the Abbey. She was glowing, not with joy, but with something more severe. Responsibility solidified into posture. Philip knelt before her. That wasn't just cute, it was constitutionally awkward. The man who usually walked 3 steps behind her now had to swear allegiance, hands clasped like a schoolboy. She looked at him briefly. Her eyes softened, and then hardened again. There would be no equals here, not anymore. The carriages rolled out in slow procession. Rain tapped against the glass like tiny drums. Elizabeth waved. Elbow, wrist, hand, repeat, and tried not to let the crown slide sideways on her hair. Inside, her shoes were soaking wet. She hadn't had a chance to change them after the Abbey. Royalty, it turns out, doesn't come with foot warmers. By nightfall, fireworks lit up the Thames and champagne was flowing in every country club, still pretending the empire hadn't ended. People danced, cried, and wrote long diary entries with sentences like, "It was the start of something." But the truth? It wasn't the start. It was a continuation. A glittering attempt to freeze time while the world outside grew louder, faster, more unpredictable. Elizabeth was now the Queen. But she was also still a woman who hadn't even had time to unpack her new desk, and she'd soon find out that the crown didn't protect you from family, or from the wild cracking sound of a sister ready to rebel. The newspapers called it the crown versus the heart, and they weren't exaggerating. It was the mid-1950s, and while Elizabeth was busy opening hospitals, christening ships, and pretending to enjoy endless dinners with minor dukes, her younger sister Margaret was busy falling in love with a divorced man. Cue the royal panic. Captain Peter Townsend had a face like a soap opera hero and the kind of war record that made old ladies swoon. He also had an ex-wife and 2 children, which, in royal math, added up to scandal. Margaret wanted to marry him. Elizabeth wanted to say yes. But the church, the parliament, the tabloids, and even Churchill said absolutely not. And here's your weird historical fact. The royal family once had Margaret followed around by plainclothes officers just to make sure she didn't secretly marry Peter on the sly. Yes, the British state assigned secret agents to monitor whether a princess might elope in a pub somewhere. That's how seriously they took the whole no divorces allowed thing. Historians still debate whether Elizabeth personally forbade the marriage or merely relayed the advice of government officials. Either way, Margaret eventually made the most painful announcement of her life. On paper, of course, in icy cursive. The younger sister's heartbreak wasn't just a tabloid saga. It reflected the central tension of Elizabeth's reign, duty over desire. That phrase sounds noble until you actually try to live it. Meanwhile, the rest of the royal family was not helping. Her uncle, the former King Edward VIII, was still sulking in Paris with Wallis Simpson, occasionally throwing shade through journalists. Her mother, now the Queen Mother, refused to move out of Buckingham Palace for ages after Elizabeth moved in, resulting in a very awkward roommate situation involving corgis, ghost tours and dueling wardrobes. Philip, for his part, was not adjusting smoothly. He hated palace life, hated the cameras, and hated giving up his Navy career. The newspapers ran stories about his secret nights out and crumbling patience. In private, he reportedly made jokes about being the world's best-dressed coat rack. Still, Elizabeth kept going. She began reshaping the monarchy in quiet ways. Televised speeches became regular. Walkabouts, where she actually met people instead of just waving at them, were introduced. She listened more than she spoke, and she never, ever reacted. One official historical fact: in 1957, Elizabeth made the first televised Christmas broadcast by a monarch. It was short, formal, and a bit awkward, but millions watched it, gripping their tea, thinking, "She's one of us." Which wasn't true, but people needed to believe it. In the background, Britain was unravelling. The empire was fracturing, India was gone, Ghana was independent, and more nations were following. Churchill, now ancient and wheezing through his final term, had warned that the empire must evolve or expire. It did both. Elizabeth travelled constantly, Nigeria, Australia, Canada, playing diplomat in pastel. But she didn't speak politics. She simply showed up, smiled, and let the crown do the heavy lifting. At home, though, the sheen was beginning to crack. There was that infamous moment in 1957 when she told her Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, that her family was not having a good year. British understatement at its peak. The public began to notice that something was off. Margaret looked sulky in public. Philip looked bored. Elizabeth looked tired. And the world was changing faster than her palace gates could open. Still, she pressed on. Opened Parliament, visited Wales, rode a horse in a parade while 7 months pregnant, all while quietly managing her mother's disapproval, her husband's midlife crisis, and her sister's longing for a life she wasn't allowed to live. That's the thing no one tells you about royalty. It's not glamorous. It's a job. And Elizabeth, she was the ultimate overachiever who never called in sick. But the real surprise came when she left the palace and started walking onto tarmacs into villages, through stadiums of screaming teenagers. Because the Queen was about to become something new, not just a monarch, a brand. By the late 1950s, Elizabeth II was no longer just a sovereign. She was a silhouette on postage stamps, a statue in miniature on school desks, a face on coins that clinked in the hands of bus drivers and bishops alike. She had become something bigger than human, a symbol, and symbols, by their nature, aren't allowed to blink. But the world around her was blinking fast. In 1957, she and Philip embarked on a 6-month Commonwealth tour. Let that sink in. 6 months. They circled the globe like clock hands, hitting Jamaica, Canada, Australia, New Zealand and Ceylon, all while smiling through heat rashes, political protests and food of wildly variable hygiene. One official fact: in Australia alone, Elizabeth attended more than 100 public events in just over 50 days. Her handshake muscles were practically weaponized. She waved from trains, waved from cars, waved from balconies. And every time she did, someone gasped. Little girls cried, men bowed, babies were held aloft like offerings. She was Britain's answer to Hollywood, but more silent, more composed, and far less likely to marry Richard Burton. And yet, even as her image solidified into perfection, the woman behind it was evolving. Her speeches, still stiff, still filtered through layers of advisers, started hinting at personal conviction. The Commonwealth bears no resemblance to empires of the past, she said. That was revolutionary, even if said in the voice of someone reading a grocery list. Here's your weird fact. Elizabeth had a personal preference for bright colours, not just because they were cheerful, but because she wanted people in the back rows to see her. She once reportedly said, "I have to be seen to be believed." That's not vanity. That's performance art. Historians still debate whether she truly understood the power of her presence, or whether she was just incredibly good at taking direction. Either way, the Queen became the glue holding together a post-imperial identity that was fraying by the minute. And then the press started to change. Reporters were getting bolder, cameras sharper. In one infamous incident, a photographer captured Elizabeth looking visibly irritated during a royal engagement. The headline: "When the Queen frowns." Tabloids had arrived, and once they were in the room, they never left. At home, the monarchy was being marketed hard. Philip spearheaded a modernisation campaign. They allowed cameras into Windsor Castle for the first time. The royal family documentary aired in 1969, but its groundwork was laid here in the late 50s. Committees, rebranding, carefully curated access. What had been whispered in drawing rooms was now printed in magazines. What was she really like? Did she love Philip? Was Margaret okay? Were the Corgis trained, or just chaotic neutral? The crown, once heavy with jewels and history, was now balanced alongside public relations. And yet nothing truly shook her. She watched Sputnik rise, Elvis sing, Castro take Cuba, and teenagers in Carnaby Street dance like they'd just escaped gravity. And she never blinked. Not in public, not on camera. Not even when the American president showed up with Jackie Kennedy in tow and practically stole the show. She adjusted, quietly, methodically, always in gloves. By 1959, the Queen was pregnant again, her third child, Andrew. She rode horses while carrying him, attended official banquets, signed legislation, managed, with barely a nod, the fact that her Prime Minister was slowly falling apart. Macmillan's health was failing, the economy was wobbling, and the country needed reassurance. She gave it without ever saying much. Because by the end of the 1950s, Elizabeth wasn't just in the monarchy, she was the monarchy. The person, the performance, the presence, all blurred into one seamless figure, draped in pastels and expectations. But here's the catch. Behind the closed doors, the real Elizabeth remained guarded, dryly funny, fiercely organised, and, if you asked palace staff, a bit of a prankster. Yes, a prankster. She once startled a group of American tourists in Balmoral by casually walking her dogs in a scarf and sweater, letting them ramble on about how they hoped to spot the Queen today. She just smiled, didn't say a word. Sometimes it's more powerful to hold the joke than to deliver the punchline. And that's where we leave her for now, 29 years old, already the most recognised woman on earth, holding together a country, a family, a world, still pretending the empire was intact. She hadn't chosen the crown, but it had chosen her. Let's slow things down. You followed her through the trees of Kenya, the echoing halls of Westminster Abbey, the silence of Buckingham Palace's upper corridors. You've watched her wave until her wrist ached, speak when she had nothing left to say, smile while the weight of 1,000 years of tradition rested on the bridge of her nose. And still, she did not break. This was not a fairy tale. It was a job description with no retirement plan. One where you can't call in sick, can't throw the crown in the bin, can't disappear without consequences. She walked into it young, unprepared, and entirely alone. And by the end of that first decade, she had made it look like she was born for it. But you know better now. You know about the delayed mourning dress, the potato practice crown, the sister she couldn't save, and the man she married but couldn't always reach. You know that behind the glamour was a very tired woman learning, in real time, how to lead a nation by not leading the way they expected. The lights are softer now. The empire has shrunk in the rearview mirror, and the woman who once bowed her head at her father's death now stands at the helm of something new. Less about conquest, more about survival. She's still here, and you're still watching her. That's the magic, isn't it? Thank you for staying with me. If you made it all the way to the end, maybe you're the kind of person who sees the shape behind the shadow, the heartbeat behind the crown. Good night, wherever you are in the world. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft noise, and let's get this story started tonight.